Hello, this is your host Nahla Hanno. Today we will look at the main ideas covered in the book Behave, first published in 2017. The author of this book is American researcher Robert Sapolski, who is a professor at Stanford University, specializing in neuroscience and human behavior. Because the book is big, both in size and amount of information it provides, this summary will extend over 3 videos, but still, I won't be able to cover all the experiments and examples given in the book. Yet, I hope that those videos are successful in drawing your attention to a book that I believe is important for 3 reasons. First, because it is written in a style and language suitable for any non-specialist. So unlike most scientific books, this book is easy to understand and also very entertaining. Second is because it helps us understand the complexities of human behavior, which should help us be more compassionate and understanding in our judgment of ourselves and others. And third, I'd say that although I admire the book, yet there are 1 or 2 points where I disagree with the author, especially on the subject of free will. But let's not jump the gun, and let's start the first video. When I started reading the book, I felt that Sapolsky is not answering 3 basic questions that I had. I guess he assumed that anyone reading the book has enough background on the subject and didn't need this introduction. So accordingly, I added the first 3 slides to make sure that each person watching this video is comfortable following the ideas in the book. The first question I had was, what steps did humanity go through until we understood the importance of the brain, and that in addition to being the maestro that controls all the functions of the body, it is also the center of feelings and actions? First, I looked at the mummification process in ancient Egypt and noticed that they preserved the 4 main internal organs, the stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines, in canopic jars like the ones here in this image. These were buried with the mummy. The only organ they left in place was the heart, believing it was the center of the person's being and intelligence. But when it came to the brain, they took it out and apparently threw it away. So I assumed that they had no awareness of the importance of the brain. But then I learned of an important papyrus that's now known as the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, which is dated around 1700 years BCE. This papyrus is like a military surgical reference, and in it we have the oldest known recorded reference to the brain and to the symptoms of brain injury, such as paralysis. It also contains the first known descriptions of the structure of the skull, the lining, and the external surface of the brain. About 1,000 years later, in Greece, Hippocrates believed the brain to be the seat of intelligence. And in the time of the Roman Empire, we have Galen, who studied the brains of animals and documented the first description of its parts. In the golden age of the Islamic Empire and in Andalusia, we have Abul Qasim al-Zahrawi, who performed surgical treatments for head injuries, skull fractures, spinal injuries, subdural infusions, and headaches. A couple of decades later, but in Central Asia, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he's known in the West, provided detailed information on skull fractures and their surgical treatments. He explained many related phenomena, such as insomnia, mania, hallucinations, nightmares, dementia, epilepsy, stroke, paralysis, vertigo, melancholy, and tremor. He was also the first person to link mental disability to the deficiency of the frontal lobe of the brain. In the age of Renaissance, we had Galen's model was corrected by Andreas Vesalius from Belgium. René Descartes, the famous French philosopher, also studied brain philosophy and proposed the theory of dualism to address the issue of the brain relationship with the mind. And the English Thomas Willis studied the brain, nerves, and behavior to develop neurological treatments. And finally, in the modern era, we can say that the brain function is better understood, but much remains unknown. The second question I had was, now that we know that the brain is the source of emotions and behaviors, what are the scientific or technical tools that help us study the brain? So what I found was that scientists and researchers interested in studying the brain started by examining animals' brain. They also studied human brains, but of course after the death of the subject. And they studied brains of victims of accidents or operations. In the early 20th century, EEGs were invented, and it peaked in the 40s to the 70s, but is now used less due to the advances in technology, which was the invention of the functional magnetic resonance imaging. And this is going to be the main tool used in most experiments described in this book. And as we see, the subject's head is in the machine, and then these scans are taken, and depending on the color shown, it would indicate high activity or low activity. So we go from the blue color indicating low activity and go through the different colors until the red, which indicate very high activity. The third and last question was, why is the science of human behavior lagging behind the rest of the medical sciences? So in the field of research, researchers posit a theory and then design experiments to test those theories empirically. When studying human behavior, applying the scientific method is almost impossible for the following reasons. Human behavior is subjective and not objective like other fields of medicine. Also, it's extremely hard to study any subject or person and conduct research on them in a natural setting. This would require a setting like what we had in the movie The Truman Show, which, as the film clearly demonstrated, is unethical. So maybe someone would suggest that we can solve this problem by acquiring the consent of the subject we plan to study. But that will probably lead to the subject adjusting or faking their behavior because they know they are being watched. And that will give us something as unnatural and maybe even as messed up as the Kardashians show. So I then wondered if there were any cases when natural human behavior was recorded for some reason, and if we study those recordings, it might be apparent to understanding human behavior. And the answer was yes. In some old reality shows, such as Candid Camera, we have good material to do exactly that. But unfortunately, the clip is copyrighted and I cannot show it to you. But as you can see from the stills, 3 employees of the show get into the elevator with the subject who's wearing the dark coat, but all 3 of them face backwards. Our subject is first confused, but slowly he starts turning around step by step in order to conform with the rest of the group. Come on, it's coming. And here he does. He does face backwards just like them, even though it doesn't make any sense. To the wall. So the show, which was meant to entertain audiences, it actually also demonstrates to us how quickly a basic social norm, in this case, how people stand in elevator could be reversed using the power of group conformity. But of course, this archive is limited and won't do. So what should scientists do? Well, they had some other options. They could study animals, and they actually did that. They studied animals in labs. But they quickly discovered that animal behavior in labs does not resemble their natural behavior. So they went and studied animals in their natural environment. A very famous example is Jane Goodall, who studied chimps, and also we have Sapolski himself, who studies baboons in East Africa. And by the way, Sapolski is the one on the left. Well, granted, animal research is important to provide insight for dealing with mental disorders such as depression and anxiety and many more. But what about studies conducted on humans? In an attempt to answer the question of how much of a person's characteristics are formed by either nature or nurture, researchers attempted to study identical twins who grew up in different environments. Here we have identical twins separated after birth. One grew up as a Jewish person, while the other grew up as a Nazi. Researchers reunited them as adults to find what is common between them, which would indicate nature or the effect of genes, and what's different, which would indicate nurture or the impact of the environment. There are many more experiments that were conducted on humans that we will discuss in this and the next videos. But I'll mention two that got a lot of attention because they were highly controversial. We have the Milgram experiment, which tests how far an individual is ready to go just to be obedient to authority. And if you're interested in knowing more about this experiment, I recommend you watch the movie The Experimenter. We also have the Stanford prison experiment. And again, if you're interested in knowing more about this very disturbing experiment, you can either watch the actual video taken at the experiment or an equally disturbing feature movie called The Experiment. And in the remaining minutes of this first video, we will examine the first 4 chapters of the book. Here we're looking at the triune brain model, which is an old model that helped organize our understanding of the brain. So we have the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the neocortex or learning brain. The innermost area, which is the stem or reptilian brain, the area indicated in red, which controls the body's automatic muscular function. Then we have the limbic system, which is the blue area, and it's also called the mammalian brain or emotional brain. Then the neocortex, or the green area, which is most advanced in humans and performs advanced and abstract thinking. As I mentioned earlier, this model is just a metaphor, and most modern-day researchers completely reject it. Another thing we need to learn about is the neurons, which is the main component of the nervous tissue in all animals. It has 3 parts: dendrites, an axon, and a cell body or soma. Dendrite, which resembles 3 branches, is where a neuron receives new input from other cells around it. Dendrites branch as they move towards their tips, just like tree branches do. The axon, or the tree roots, is the output structure of the neuron. When a neuron wants to talk to another one, it sends an electric message through the entire axon. The soma, or the tree trunk, is where the nucleus lies, where the neuron's DNA is housed, and where proteins are made to be transported through the axon and the dendrites. So these are kind of storage that hold the neurotransmitters until the neuron is excited, and then it releases the neurotransmitters into the synapse. So as you see, the neurons don't touch, but communicate by sending chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. Examples of neurotransmitters are dopamine, adrenaline, serotonin, and many more that you might have heard of. Well, a couple of slides ago, when I mentioned problems regarding studying human behavior, Sapolski actually tells us that there is yet another problem. He says that there has always been studies from the point of view of different sciences or specializations. So, let's imagine that you are eating at a restaurant and your server has repeatedly been late bringing out your food. What will your reaction be? Will you wait patiently, get up and leave, or start yelling at him? Now, no matter what your behavior is, what is the meaning of your behavior? If we ask neurobiologists, then they will say that you behave in this way because of your genes or because of the hormone levels in your body at that moment. If we ask a psychologist the same question, then they might say you behaved in this way because of certain childhood experiences you had. And if we ask sociologists, they might start talking about the culture, political, and religious structures that shaped you. So Sapolsky believes we lack the comprehensive study that takes all these sciences or fields of study into account. And that's exactly is what he's trying to do in this book. His attempt to explain the human behavior not only by studying neurons and hormones, but also through psychology, evolution, culture, and history. Thus, Sapolsky is trying to create a more accurate picture of why we perform a certain action without falling into the tunnel vision problem of a particular academic discipline. There are multiple lenses through which we can look at human behavior. None of them are really right or wrong. They are all intertwined. Human behavior is usually the result of multiple things interacting in complex ways. Let's imagine the same issue at the restaurant again, but this time we study behavior from a temporal perspective. A second before the behavior, seconds to minutes before the behavior, hours to days before the behavior. What happened when this person was growing up? What happened at the adolescence, at their childhood, when they were a fetus? What was the genetic makeup of their upbringing? What was the cultural effect of the environment they grew in? And finally, what was the population and species attribute that developed over thousands or even millions of years? Now we're starting the second chapter. What happened a few seconds before the action was taken? So let's see what happens with the neural circuits in certain areas of the brain during those seconds. Remember when we said that sometimes we study victims of injuries? Let's discuss the case of Phineas Gage, the most famous patient in the field of neurology. He was a foreman on the railroad construction crew and was injured in 1848 when explosive powder caused an iron rod to fly through the left side of his face and out of the upper anterior portion of his skull, taking most of the left frontal cortex with it. Phineas Gage actually survived the accident and regained his health, but the esteemed Gage was changed. In the words of the doctor who followed him over the years, the balance between his intellectual faculties and his animal tendencies seemed to have been destroyed. Gage became disrespectful, used the most horrific profanities, which he never did before, showed little respect for his colleagues, was impatient with restraint or advice when it conflicted with his desires. So because of this freak accident, we understood that the frontal cortex is the area responsible for restraining us from doing animalistic or uncivilized behavior. A second interesting case is the case of Charlie Whitman. If I told you that this guy has killed 16 people, including his mother and wife, how would you judge him? Now, let me tell you a little more about him, and then I'll ask you for your opinion of him one more time. Charlie was born in Florida. He was an intelligent and polite boy who rarely lost his temper. His academic achievements were encouraged by his parents, and any indication of failure was met with physical discipline from his father. The father collected firearms and taught Charlie how to shoot. After graduation from high school, Charlie joined the Marine Force to escape the violence at home. He later joined the University of Austin to study engineering. After he got married, he started getting in trouble. He was discharged from the army and couldn't keep a job. He saw a psychiatrist and complained about unprovoked aggression, including beating his wife. After his parents separated, Charlie took his mom to live in Austin so she's safe from the father's violence. A couple of months later, Charlie wrote a suicide note, then went to his mother's house and killed her. He returned home and killed his wife. He then headed to his old college where he shot and killed 14 people and wounded dozens more before the police shot him dead. In a suicide note he left behind, Charlie requested an autopsy of his brain. It actually revealed a tumor pressing on the amygdala. The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure in the brain. We can see it here in the color red. It plays a key role in fears, phobias, and anxiety, and the fight or flight response. The amygdala is also crucial in generating aggression. So what we know now, before the accident, the amygdala was aroused by the tumor pressing on it to the point of turning Charlie into a murderous monster. So now that you understand what happened inside Charlie's brain before he killed his victims, how do you judge him? Do you still think he's a monster, or do you now see him as a victim? Let's now look at what happens seconds to minutes before the behavior. Well, most of our actions are actually a response to external stimuli. Various sensory information can prompt the brain into action. In other words, they are the triggers of our actions. Our brain receives those stimuli through different triggers, but mainly via the 5 senses. The sense of smell, hearing, seeing, touching, and tasting. Now let's see how different people can respond differently to the same stimuli or triggers. In this experiment, we will have a number of volunteers monitored by an fMRI machine while they're looking at pictures of faces of different people. In all experiments, when the subjects saw a face, let's say that of Jennifer Aniston, this red area on both sides of the brain was activated. This is the fusiform. It is the area of the brain responsible for recognizing faces. When we showed the volunteers a purple face, the fusiform responded normally and was not fooled. It realizes that this is just a natural face modified with Photoshop. Now let's show the volunteers a face of a black man. Now, in this case, for some subjects, another area of the brain was activated. That area is the amygdala, which we talked about in the case of Charlie Whitman. And we said it is activated in response to aggression or fear. So subjects who have racist ideas about black people will show amygdala activity. Furthermore, the more racist someone is, the more activation there will be. A face of an Asian girl will typically only activate the fusiform. During COVID, some racist and misinformed subjects will also show amygdala activity. A veiled woman, again, will only trigger the amygdala of people who are Islamophobes. Another example that highlights the fact that our senses can be deceiving. An experiment was conducted by psychologists where they asked some subjects to hold a warm cup of coffee and asked others to hold a cup of iced coffee. The experimenters found that people judged others to be more generous and caring and loving if they had just held a warm cup of coffee, and less so if they had held an iced coffee. So their impression of the same person would differ depending on whether they were holding something warm or something cold. Now let's move backward in time and see what happens hours to days before the behavior. Here we'll enter the realm of hormones. What is the effect of hormones on the brain and sensory systems, as we mentioned in the last chapter? How do hormones influence our best and worst behaviors? Testosterone is a hormone that is present in males at a level higher than its levels in females. And therefore, it is usually how higher aggression in males is explained. Actually, testosterone has far less to do with aggression than most assume. Within the normal range, individual differences in testosterone levels don't predict who will be aggressive. Moreover, the more an organism has been aggressive, the less testosterone is needed for future aggression. So let's say we have two individuals, and the testosterone level in one is higher than the other. This does not mean that if both are triggered, then the one with the higher levels will certainly be more aggressive. He will have a higher potential of aggression, but whether he becomes aggressive or not will also depend on other factors, such as being subjected to violence while growing up. That's why Sapolski keeps insisting in the book that every time we think we broke the code and understood how certain behaviors are triggered, we discovered that behaviors are the result of a complex system that cannot be explained by one simple phenomenon. Here we will look at the oxytocin hormone. Unlike testosterone, oxytocin is present at higher levels in females than in males. We can call it the love hormone as it's responsible for creating a strong bond between loved ones, a child and a pet, or the more obvious example, between a mother and a child. But remember the disclaimer in the previous slide. When we think we understand the effect of oxytocin, we discover that because it plays such an important role in bonding, it can actually increase ethnocentric bias too. So it can make a mother become more aggressive defending his children, or a brother defending his siblings. To better understand the function of cortisol, let's look back at our ancestors, the hunter-gatherers. Normally, their bodies are in a state of resting, healing, and if they just had a meal, it is in a state of digesting. In this case, the cortisol levels are low. But when they face a stressful situation, like a fierce animal attack, the level of the cortisol hormone increases in their bodies to change their status from rest, healing, and digesting to the fight or flight response, so they can kill the attacker or run away from it. After the danger is over, which only takes minutes or maximum few hours, their cortisol level returns to normal and they are back to the relaxed, healthy status. Now, as modern humans, our relaxed body still responds in the same way to stress. For instance, for not being able to meet the financial demands of one's family, or having a loved one suffering from a serious illness. In those cases, and many others like them, this stress cannot be resolved in minutes or a few hours. So, stress chemicals stay in our bodies for a long time, resulting in chronic stress, which can be very damaging. It saps the immune system and increases vulnerability to sickness and infection, and also increases the risk of high blood pressure and diabetes. Stress makes it harder for our prefrontal cortex to regulate our amygdala, making it harder to unlearn irrational fears, and we also are not able to think right. This concludes the first video. I hope to see you in part 2 to review the following chapters. Bye now.